contracts out with. They're called comprehensive or intensive foster care homes, but this is it's also called unrestricted, a departmental foster care home. And now she's in a group home. Susie's going to a group home, which is a congregate care facility. And typically foster parents would be the special education decision maker when a child is in DCF custody, but because the child's in a group home, there are no foster parents. So that's why we appoint a special education surrogate parent to those kids. So I hope that cleared up your question, Margaret. Maybe it was a little,
thank you.
Maybe it was a little too much information.
No, great.
Okay, so Susie is bright and athletic. She plays soccer on the school team and loves cats. She's gentle with cats now, but she had to be taught how to deal with them without getting scratched and getting mad at them. She states she wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, and she is quite good in math and science. So Susie definitely has some strengths, many strengths, and things that she likes to do, right? So at school, Susie gets into trouble several times a week for swearing at teachers and peers. The vice principal, Mr. Johnson, frequently had to ask the foster parents to come pick her up midday after she has had a scuffle at recess. The school asks that she have consequences for her actions at home, such as loss of computer time, but the adults are reluctant to do this as they don't understand the reasons why she gets into fights at school. At home, she will have meltdown when privileges are taken away. So you can see how some of the behaviors are just happening in school and some of the behaviors are happening across the board. Because school, sometimes there can be triggers at school and they aren't at the group home or in the foster home, right? And vice versa, or all over the place. So sometimes kids show the similar behaviors in all settings and sometimes they don't. And that's something that the team needs to figure out. All right, so what is developmental childhood trauma? And I did mean to say developmental here, so not departmental. All right, developmental trauma. Whoops, sorry about that. I'm getting this all wrong. Is the result of a child's exposure to prolonged and or multiple events of maltreatment. So it differs from a single event trauma. Single events can certainly impact a person, right? And triggers can happen later on. And a person, if they get into a car accident, can be terrified to go into a car or refuse to get into a car. So that's very real. I don't want to discount that as being something that happens to people. The difference is developmental trauma changes the brain, and we'll get a little bit more into that. It changes the way the brain works, the way kids respond to the world, and the way kids look at the world in general. So it kind of affects them on a much more global scale in their own head, in their own body. So it also, we'll get a little bit more into this later, but can result in poor long-term health outcomes, mental health and physical health. So if the mom is a victim of domestic violence, she uses substances or is poorly nourished, they may have a toxic effect on the baby's brain development while still in utero. So we saw this with Susie. There was domestic violence in her life and she was neglected when she was a child. So she's got a lot of cortisol and stress hormones going through her body. She's getting triggered. She experienced developmental trauma. So it's going, and she possibly, or she said she used alcohol during her first trimester, which all affect Susie and Susie's brain and how Susie learns and looks at the world. It involves childhood maltreatment. So that can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and profound neglect. I just want to differentiate a little bit or talk about neglect. Most of the kids in DCF custody are there because of parental neglect. Neglect is a very wide definition in the child welfare world. So not protecting a child from a neighbor's sexual abuse is considered to be neglect. You know, profound neglect, like not feeding a child or leaving, like Susie's mom did, leaving her when she was little for days at a time, that's definitely neglect. Having domestic violence present in the child's life is considered to be neglect, right? So those, and then there's physical and sexual abuse are a little bit more defined, I think, and understandable to people, but neglect comes in a lot of different forms, and it often involves a primary caregiver, right? So a parent, relative, a child care provider, some type of a trusted adult. For the most part, when kids experience abuse and neglect, it's at the hands of somebody that they love, care about, and who is looking out for their safety, but they're being hurt by them. So that is just not the way that the brain is supposed to perceive the world, right? We're supposed to perceive the world as being kept safe and cared for. So the effects on the brain. So again, we're just scratching the surface here. We're not going to get into the weeds. There are whole, week-long trainings about trauma and all the different hormones and the neurons, and we're just going to scratch the surface so that we can talk about it in terms of education. So the brain functioning might be damaged or delayed, and you can see in this picture here a scan of the brain. On the one on the right, there's less activity, it's less developed, it's an abused brain. And the one on the left, there's more action going on in the healthy brain. It's especially true in those areas that are circled where social emotional learning takes place, empathy, remorse, taking others' perspective. And oftentimes kids in DCF custody who are in group homes are on they have a social emotional disability and behavior issues. A lot of the kids, not all of them, but a lot of the kids. And this is why. So traumatic events activate systems in the brain and the body, which are actually required for survival, right? So some of these hormones are there, the, adrenaline, which really gets you going, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and norepinephrine, they're there for a reason to help people survive in situations where they're in danger. So normally we would, some of those stress hormones would be released if we were getting chased by a dog, right? And it's a good thing for our muscles to react and for our heart rate to go up and for us to get stronger, like we can run faster. Those are all good things to help us get away from the dog or fight the dog, right? So, but when a child is experiencing those in their brain and their body constantly, it does damage to them and it impacts the brain in negative ways and the body. So the responses can then take place when they're not needed, right? So the responses are to fight, so to go back at the dog, to flee and take off, to flock, to go find other people for protection, to freeze and just stay there and not do anything, and to fawn, which that's usually trying to ingratiate oneself to the abuser or to the dog. Hi, puppy, how are you? Come and talk to me. It's that trying to appeal to that person or that threat to get it to stop. And so in the situation with a dog, that's appropriate to do all of those things, right? But when children are in a classroom setting and somebody's being loud and that triggers them and they run out of the classroom, we need to help them work on coping skills for when they get triggered and hopefully not run out of the classroom. Or what do they do when they come out of the classroom? So these are things the kids are experiencing very often throughout the day instead of just when the dog goes after them. And when they happen over a long period of time, it becomes the brain's normal response. So for that person, for that individual, it's a normal response because that's what their brain learned and that's what their brain knows. Even though to others who had not experienced trauma, it might seem like it doesn't make sense. To that traumatized person's brain, it makes sense. So the memory of complex trauma is stored and recalled in the brain and the body. So there's an awesome book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's about the traumatized individual and how that's also stored. The trauma is stored in their body. We're focusing on the brain today, but because it affects behavior a lot and social emotional functioning, which greatly impacts kids in school, but it also is in the body, and that can lead to very poor health outcomes as the child grows up. The memories can be recalled even though even through the senses if the trauma occurred prior to cognitive memories, right? So if a child, typically people start to have cognitive memories from around the age of 3. That's very generalized and typical. It can vary, but our brain was growing and learning and responding before we were 3. So even if we don't have the memory of the dog going after us, or mom getting beat up by dad, or not getting fed, if we don't have that conscious memory, that's in our body and in our brain. They're internal triggers, and new experiences are colored by that. So the child's new experiences are, there's kind of a trauma filter or a trauma lens on the world for them. So toxic stress disrupts the development of neurons. So you can see this picture on the top is a picture of the neurons pathways of a traumatized brain. And the one on the bottom is a non-traumatized brain. So the functions can be damaged or delayed. And it's especially true, again, in the frontal areas of the brain where higher learning occurs. So speech, language, reading, math, executive function. Executive function challenges are something that we often see with kids in DCF custody who are traumatized as well. All right, so what are the key points of Susie's history that stand out for you? I am going to ask people to participate, and if you don't want to, it's okay. But if you want to go back and just kind of think about that a little bit, what are things that you remember from it? So if you remember them, then they probably stood out for you. So does anyone want to take a crack at it? There's no right or wrong answer. This is just your own memory of what happened. So Margaret?
I was going to say generational trauma.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So, and it's possible, given the neglect that Susie and her mom experienced, that education wasn't looked after. If her needs weren't looked after as a person who's relying on an adult to be cared for, if her mom was taking off, I don't know, we can assume that perhaps education and school was not part of the picture. I see somebody in the chat. Sexualized behavior, absolutely. And we'll find out more about whether or not that's happening in school, because sometimes any behavior can show up in school. It didn't sound like it from the description. It sounded like it was happening when the foster dad was present. It wasn't mentioned as happening at school, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. I want to take a minute here, and I'm really glad that that was brought up. So when we are a special education decision maker, whether we're the parent of a child who experienced trauma, whether we're the foster parent, whether we're the special education surrogate parent, we don't need to share the details of the trauma with the child's school. That is what the school needs to know, is that the child experienced developmental trauma. Now, sometimes if something specific comes up, it can be helpful to the school to know some of the child's experience. But for special education surrogate parents, that decision about how much to share with the school is really up to DCF, because they're the child's legal parent. So sometimes the SESP doesn't know anything about the child's history. They might know just very general that they are in DCF custody and they experienced abuse or neglect. And that's really all you need to know, because what you're really looking at when you look at the IEP is how is the student communicating and behaving, and what do we need to do to help them learn the skills to cope and function in the classroom. So we're looking at this because we know, but the school doesn't need to know all of these details. It's part of it's a confidentiality issue. And sometimes I had this situation, an SESP called me a couple of weeks ago because the child had a neuropsychological evaluation and there were a lot of personal details in there. And so in a neuropsych, for some people who are looking at it, that's super helpful and they need to know, but a school doesn't need to know all of those details. So some of those the DCF asked for them to go back and be removed because when these things are shared with the school, they stay with the student for their whole school experience. And the kids have experienced very horrible things and they have a right to have privacy about it. And if they choose to share it on their own, they can do that. And some kids do, but we don't need to share things which aren't absolutely essential for the school to know.
Suzanne, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
So I'm an adoptive mom of 3 kids, who are 27, 21, and 13. I'm also a middle school teacher, and 2 of my 3 have special needs. So I've been at many IEP meetings, and this has been a problem for me where we actually went out, the school paid for a neuropsych and put things in there that were, it got very complicated because the school system paid for the neuropsych. Yeah. And I had to really advocate and get very loud. And, I said I was calling my attorney, not that I actually had one, but I said it anyway. And so this is part of the reason why I wanted to go through this training and hopefully help others. But I would just encourage everyone who has access to a neuropsych to carefully read through it, because there was really some ridiculous stuff that even another example in my case. I know this would be a little bit different because for my daughter, the adoption had gone through, but for some strange reason, the neuropsychologist was putting her birth name in the neuropsych, which her name is actually at this point in time, her name had been changed for 9 years. Oh. And so I just encourage everybody, to do anything and everything you feel that is right for the child, because you're the one who will have the child's best interests in mind.
Right, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. Did you end up getting those things taken out?
Redacted? I did, but what I really ultimately wound up doing was a year later, we redid the neuropsych with someone who was more trauma informed.
Right.
And it's been a pretty crazy uphill year. I happen to be a teacher in the same school as my daughter. So,
oh,
wow. We're now going out of district. So it's been dicey, but I'm a parent before I'm a teacher as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your story. I'm glad that even though it sounds like it's been tough, I'm glad that you were able to
We're getting there.
to get things taken out. And I just want to look at somebody else put something in the chat too, and I can't seem to find the chat at the moment. So I'm sorry for that.
Elizabeth said left alone in a hotel room at 5 years old. Right. And Tamara said multiple placements.
Right. So for all we know, if Susie was left alone as a child, she doesn't like to be left alone in general. I'm just wondering, right? So that could impact her at school or having adults leave the room. I mean, I'm not Susie, so I don't know, but those are some things to think about. And then I'm glad the person brought up the multiple placements, because every time a child moves, it is traumatic for them. Even if they were removed from an unhealthy, unsafe situation, that's what they know, right? So, and they might be in a safer situation, but it's still really, 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 really hard. And so the more placements a child has, sometimes it leads to problems with attachment, being able to attach to other people. And I don't want to get too into it with Susie because we don't really know, but and oftentimes when kids move placements, they change schools. So there are many kids who have a really high mobility rate, right, between foster homes and between schools. And I don't know if for anybody who's ever changed a school, especially in the middle of the year, it's really tough. And imagine if you're doing it away from your family and in a house with people that you don't know, right? So that on top of the trauma, that can just really add to a child struggling in general. And since we're talking about school, in school. All right, I am not going to actually read this again because we just talked about it. If anybody wants me to come back to it, then I definitely will just say the word and I'll go back to it. But I'm going to concentrate a little bit just more on Susie, We already talked about how she was left alone and she didn't have food. Mom was arrested several times. She may or may not have been with Susie when she was prostituting. We don't know that, but it's a possibility. She's had a lot of moves. She's had sexualized behavior. She's now in a group home, which is also tough, right? It's a totally different environment. Kids are with other kids that are struggling and in a similar situation. So sometimes things don't work out for them in the group home and they move to a new group home. So that poses its own set of challenges and different kinds of triggers, and being with a lot of peers who are getting triggered too. But Susie, we have to remember that Susie is not just her trauma, right? Susie's a person and she's bright, she's athletic, she has things she likes to do. She likes cats. She had a little bit of a tough time with cats, but not anymore. She plays soccer. She's good at math and science. She knows that she wants to be a vet. Right. I mean, a lot of kids don't know what they want to do, but she seems to have her sights pretty set. And all of those are strengths which need to be recognized in her IEP. And it's part of the vision also of what she wants out of her life. She does get in trouble for swearing at teachers and peers. This is something that I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent on this one, because I just need to address this because it's something that happens a lot. The vice principal frequently had to ask the foster parents to come pick her up midday after she has had a scuffle at recess. Whenever a school calls the caregiver and asks the child to be picked up for behavior, what should that be called? Does anybody know the answer? That is a suspension.
It's a suspension.
Yes, it is a suspension. So I ran a discipline and suspension training the other day, and I have a lot of experience working with kids who get suspended and disciplined. And we do one a month. So just like we do this trauma training once a month, we do the discipline and suspension and also transition. So if you're interested in that. But when a principal picks or an administrator says, come and pick up the child early for behavior, not because they're sick, not because they need to go to the doctor, but because of behavior, that's a suspension. And especially if a child is on an IEP, it's important to have that documented as a suspension, because kids on IEPs have protections about under school discipline. So I won't, if somebody wants to contact me, I'll give you my name and my contact information if you want to talk more about that. But this is in here, so I just had to say it because it happens with the kids we work with all the time. They get group homes, parents, foster parents get calls, come and get her, she's having a hard time. And we need to figure out why that is and how to support her so that she doesn't have a hard time and can function and succeed in the school setting. So they don't.
I thought it was funny too that it says the school asks that she have consequences for her actions at home. Like I know they didn't say what kind of consequences, but yeah. I was just surprised by that.
Yeah,
I'm sure they do that sometimes. I personally don't feel like the school should be telling you that you should be giving consequences for what's at home, but.
No, I know what you're saying, because I thought about that too. And everybody has a different philosophy about that. I'm with you. And this is not part of the training. This is just my personal philosophy. School is school, home is home. It's great to connect and communicate and maybe have some strategies in place that are used in both settings. Like at home, the foster parents or the group home might say, hey, this works for Susie here. Maybe you can try it in school. But the whole consequence, having a consequence outside of school for something that happened in school, especially when the child is just having a hard time, right? They're having a hard time for their trauma. That's up for debate. Some people think that that's the way to go, and some people don't. So I don't have an answer for that. All right. So we already, I won't go too into this. We talked about the intergenerational issues with trauma, which have passed along to Susie and more directly from her mom. And the key points that stood out for us, we talked about a lot of this, her strengths. She has the whole family history. She was abandoned. She was taken into custody. She's been in multiple placements. She's dysregulated at school. She gets into fights. She has sexualized behavior towards foster dad. We're probably missing some, but these are all things that lead to trauma and show themselves in school to with how the child is functioning in school. This is kind of what leads to that and changes, contributed to changing the brain and contributed to the developmental trauma. All right, so what are some of the neurological symptoms? Again, we're going to kind of scratch the surface on this. So hyperarousal, that means that somebody is unable to regulate their emotions, and they tend to be very extreme, the emotions. So instead of being a little bit annoyed, a child can become enraged, right? Or instead of being a little bit quiet, they can go off in the corner and with their face in the corner and not want to talk to anybody, right? So these behaviors tend to be big. The arousal tends to lead to big behaviors. Lack of attention and concentration. So some of those stress hormones that go through the body interfere with sleep. Even if they're not they don't happen at night. They're in the body, they're moving around, they interfere with sleep. A lot of kids that experience trauma, or people that experience trauma, have a difficult time sleeping. There are many kids that experience trauma who have the symptoms of ADHD, right? So, and there's some controversy out there. Does the medication help or not? Because the source of this is a little bit different. And that is not for me to decide. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I know that there's some talk about that out there. Being hypervigilant, constantly aware of perceived dangers in the environment, like thinking that something is going to happen. It's really hard to pay attention when you think something bad's going to happen. And I'll just give an example. Sometimes preferential seating in accommodations, people think that means have the child sit up near the front. Well, that is not true for every child. For some children who are hypervigilant, that is very, very disconcerting to them and uncomfortable, because they would much be better sitting toward the back and away from the door, right? Because then they can see what's going on in front of them. And some people think, oh, that's distracting. Well, you need to figure that out. For some kids, they can feel more comfortable. So it's preferential seating. That means preferential to where it works for the child, not necessarily in the front. So that's one way. I've seen that happen before, and people think, oh, well, have them be near the teacher and it'll help the child pay attention. They might be able to pay attention better if they're sitting in the back. And that's something that the adults need to observe about the child. And hopefully the child can verbalize some of that as well. But sometimes the kids don't know, or sometimes they're not able to verbalize it. And then poor impulse control. Kids can kind of just do things really quickly without thinking. They're unable to delay gratification or wait for their needs or wants to be met. So that is something that we often see, and just a high rate of impulsivity. And that can really interfere with the way a child copes in school, and it can sometimes be disruptive as well. All right. So there's a tendency, somatization is a tendency to experience and communicate stress in the form of physical symptoms. So since trauma is held in the body also, I mean, people who weren't traumatized sometimes have a stomach ache when they're anxious, right? So a lot of the kids that we work with or who were traumatized are kind of frequent flyers at the nurse's office. And those complaints are real. Those are not made up. The child just knows that, you know, for the most part anyway, those are things that the child is physically feeling. I'm having trouble seeing, my side hurts, my arm is bothering me. If they're hyper aroused and hyper vigilant, something that seems small, like a scratch to somebody who's not traumatized, might seem really big and really painful to somebody who is traumatized. A lot of kids have sensory issues who are traumatized and react in a bigger way to sensations that others might not react to at all, or just a little bit. So we talked a bit about this, but the inability to form appropriate attachments, right? So I won't get into attachment theory, but there's all different kinds of attachments, and kids who are moved around a lot. And some of these children were moved around when they were really, really little, or some of the children left their mom at the hospital, right? And they could have like the most amazing caregiver. They could have the most amazing foster parent or aunt, but they were still removed from a parent. And then if the kids are moved around a lot when they're younger, especially when they're younger, it does impact kids when they're older as well, of course. But when the brain, the really high time of intense development, it can affect them even more. And that can look many different ways. For instance, I had a child who was in kindergarten, and she was removed from the home, and she was physically all over the teacher. She wanted to hug her and kiss her and be on her lap. And that is not an appropriate situation in school, right? That's not so. And that had a lot to do with attachment. And so that was something that the school needed to really work on with her, because she also wasn't learning, right? She was very very conscious of just being with the teacher and needing to be right there sort of on the teacher. And that didn't work for anybody. It took a while to help her. She was 5 years old, you know, and she didn't understand why she was doing that. And one of the things that helped is changing the visits with her parents or bio parents to after school instead of in the morning. Crystal is a foster parent too. So I'm sure she definitely has something to add here, or even to correct me on. So go ahead, Crystal.
I will correct you on nothing. I just wanted to give a couple of instances. We had foster parents. We had a little boy back in September, and they had found him wandering around on the streets. And Friday night, he came to us after being at the hospital all day. And we thought, oh my God, this kid is fantastic. This is great. They had no information on him. Saturday and Sunday and Monday was a horror show. He was so traumatized from being found out on the street, from being away from his mom. He kept calling me mom. We finally got him to calm down. He sat in a box and leaned up against my leg. They wanted to diagnose him with autism, and I have a very good working relationship with our office. And the supervisor called me, and she's like, Crystal, you know, you don't think he's autistic? I said, no, I don't. I said, I think he's really being misdiagnosed. I said, this kid has so much trauma that he's calling me mom, wants to sit close to me. And my other kids are like, no, I don't think so. You know, how can he call you mom? And it was very sad, and it was very hard on all of us. But like, he's leaving to go to another placement, and he's like, bye mom, bye mom, bye mom. And it was just so hard to see that.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because it shows how, even though this child was removed from a tough situation, he had a really hard time, right? He didn't say, oh, great, now I'm safe. It doesn't work that way, even though he was safe, right? He didn't feel that way. He didn't know you. He was trying to, figure things out. And it's not uncommon for our kids to get misdiagnosed, because they have these big trauma symptoms, which look like something else. And so we talked about the trauma-informed neuropsychological evaluation. It's really important to consider all that and look at the big picture, even if we don't want the details in the report, but for the neuropsychologist to look at the developmental trauma and kind of tease that out, because that will make a difference in how we help the child learn how to cope. So Safida?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that homeschool relationship is also very important in terms of understanding children, their needs, and then communicating with the parents. I had a similar experience when I was working in a special education classroom. I had a child, he would come in the morning and then he would cry and then cry. And then one day I just held him in my lap, and then I felt like he was sleepy. So I put him, on a beanbag to sleep. And then he started doing the same pattern. He would come and then he would hug me, and then he would sit on my lap, and then, then he would sleep. Then the pattern, when I noticed the pattern of not sleeping, so I spoke to the mom, and then I learned that they had started a business, the husband and wife. They had other three children. So this child would go home and then he would just sleep. And then when everybody will have their dinner and then sleep, he would wake up and then he would just play all along. So in the morning, he, by 4 o'clock he would sleep, and then they will wake him up. So that pattern was going on, and then the mother, she didn't realize that. When I spoke to her, I said, you need to put him asleep, and then don't let him sleep when he comes home. So I think that was helpful. So I think as a teacher, it's really important to understand children's needs and then where they come from. When something happens, so you have to be critical to understand that something is behind whatever is going on.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
behavior one is communication, right? And also you had this pattern at home that was repeating itself at school, and it wasn't really working at school. So the fact that it's in that instance, it was super helpful it's always helpful for schools and families and group homes and DCF to keep in contact with each other, right?
Right.
But in that particular instance, sharing those details was helpful, and the parent obviously felt comfortable doing it. Right. So that worked out well. I'm glad that he no longer was sleeping at school.
Yeah, it started improving then.
Yeah, great. So one of the things that happens is kids who experience trauma, there can be adults who have unconditional love and empathy, but a lot of times those people are feared, right? So if a child is hit by his mom and dad, but he felt an attachment and a trust with them and empathy, another adult who's showing some of those same, some love and some trust, it might be scary because the child might think, oh gosh, are these people going to hit me? It's confusing getting love and abuse at the same time, right? Because many kids that are getting abused and neglected are also getting love from their parents at the same time, right? And sometimes not, but sometimes it's that kind of a mixed situation. And so when they see that love and empathy from other adults who are safe, it just might be super scary for them. Okay. So what is the body's response? We have mentioned this already. So the ACE study, I'm not going to go super into that. Probably a lot of people have heard of it, but it's the Adverse Child Experiences study. It was done, was one of the largest investigations conducted to look at associations between childhood maltreatment or trauma and later health and well-being. And it was actually done by a cardiology group, looking at, you know, people coming in and why were they having heart problems, and assessing, looking, so, you know, people noticing like, wow, when we start talking to them about growing up, we think that there's a correlation, and it was shown in this study that there was. So an adverse child experience, I don't know all 10 of them off the top of my head, but there are things like being physically abused, being sexually abused, neglected, a parent in prison, divorce, a parent with a significant mental health issue. I didn't do the ACE study and decide on these adverse events, but I think going into foster care probably could be put into that category, right? Just that the mere fact of going into foster care and being with caregivers that you don't know. So when we look at the chart, you can see the percentage of academic problems and concerns increase by the sort of the number of these adverse experiences that they've had. And it also is true with medical issues, right? So in the ACE studies, they found that people, the more adverse child experiences they had, the worse their health was, for lack of a better way to say it, the more health problems they had. And if you want to look this up, if you just look up ACE, you can take the ACE test yourself if you want to, and score yourself. And maybe you have a 0 ACE score, maybe you have a 10 of an ACE score. And it's, you know, there can be other things in there. Some people have said poverty, people who grow up in abject poverty, that should be an adverse child experience. So this just gives, the ACE study gives you an idea, but the basic takeaway is that adverse childhood experiences, whatever they are, affect the adult later health-wise, and affect academic performance of kids in school, and overall functioning in school as well. Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. It is 10:51. So why don't we come back? Yeah, around 10:55, 56, something like that. Go get a drink of water, walk around, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes.